Good evening and welcome to our Good Friday service. Rather unusual circumstances again, but of course that doesn't stop us from holding on to the meaningful worship services of Holy Week. I want to make a brief announcement just prior to this service. This is a service we've done for a number of years here at Bethlehem. Not everyone, of course, sees themselves coming to a Good Friday service. It's not normal in many Protestant worship houses. But nonetheless, we have done this here for a number of years, and it's been very meaningful for those who have given themselves to the experience. And it is an experience. You will find that there is imagery here. There is emotion. It's mainly caught up in the metaphor of light and darkness and the shadows that Jesus experienced during the course of his life, his entire life. And so be aware of those, and perhaps you'll want to darken the room where you're sitting just now in order to participate in this and capture the darkness. Perhaps along the way, as we share the stories that are part of the life of Jesus, along the way you may want to close your eyes and just take in the words. So think about how we approach this service of worship. It's a special day, and one in which we find great meaning in the crucifixion of our Lord Jesus Christ. Let us pray. Living and eternal God, we are here, and because we are here, we know, according to your promise, that you are here. Thank you for drawing us into this moment of worship. Cause us to sense your presence in ways perhaps that we have never sensed it before, as we live through the life and the death of our Lord. Help us to grasp its meaning through the course of his life. We pray in his name. Amen.
I know that my time is coming soon. It's been so long, such a long time since I've lived with peace and rest. Now I'm here, my destination. I guess things work for the best, and I know that my time is coming soon. Who is this man who magnifies me that they call the King of the world? They don't believe he's the Messiah. Somehow I know that it's true. Have him in my belief, the beat till he beat. Get him to the top, raise him out. Yeah, they raise him up next to me. My time has come, and I'm slowly fading. I deserve what I receive. Jesus, when you are in your kingdom, could you please remember me? Oh Lord, he looks at me still holding on, the tears fall from his eyes. He says I tell the truth today, you will be with me in paradise. And I know that my time, yes, my time is coming soon. And I know that my time, yes, my time is coming soon. And I know paradise, paradise is coming soon.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it. there came a man who was sent from God. His name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all men might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. The true light that gives light to every man was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decisions or a husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth.
The prophets were very clear about this light which was to come. Isaiah was the clearest of all in his welcome of the Messiah.
Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will be with child and will give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots a branch will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of power, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord. And he will delight in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes, or decide by what he hears with his ears. But with righteousness he will judge the needy. With justice he will give decisions for the poor of the earth. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth. With the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. Righteousness will be his belt, and faithfulness the sash around his waist. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering. Like one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not.
The promise of Jesus came as God's light, and that light came to a very dark world. Even as he was born, there began to be shadows that seemed to creep and cast themselves across his life. You remember the very first moment, of course, the angel visitation. They came to Mary, and Mary was greatly troubled by the news that she heard from the angel Gabriel. "How could this be?" she asked, "for I have not known a man." And the angel gave her comfort, saying that this was from God. At first, Joseph, when he heard about it, wanted no parts of it at all. And yet the angel came and visited Joseph too and comforted him, so that he accepted his role as father of the one who would be the Messiah. Bethlehem, that was the place. It was bad enough after making that journey about 90 miles to the south that they could find no way to rest except in a stable. And then there was the birth of Jesus, and the first visitors were angels, animals, shepherds. They were the first to greet him. There were the wise men who came a bit later on. And on the way, they were waylaid by wicked King Herod. Tell me where and when you find him, so that I may come and worship him too. Well, they knew that Herod was up to no good. And so as they began to make their way home, they were warned in a dream not to go back to Herod. And that was a very crucial decision, of course. But it also led to a very sad moment in the life of the city of Bethlehem. For wicked King Herod sent his soldiers and had all of the boys under 2 years old in Bethlehem killed in what was known as the murder of the innocents. He was so discouraged, so corrupt, that he could not even bear to have a child as a possible rival. Well, Jesus was presented at the temple for those matters that are important, the circumcision and so forth. And when they arrived at the temple, there was Simeon. Simeon said to Mary in a very prophetic manner, "A sword will pierce your soul." And you see these shadows began to form. They began to fall, even as Jesus is born. We don't know much about Jesus' childhood. There's only one story that is remembered in the Gospel of Luke. It was when Jesus was 12 years old. They make the trip to celebrate the Passover in Jerusalem. And Jesus somehow gets left behind. We're not clear about how that could have happened with mother and father, except that they went on out ahead, and Jesus was not with the crowd that was going back to Nazareth. They were frantic as they were looking for Jesus. But they found him. They found him in the temple, and Jesus said, "Did you not know that I would be in my Father's house?" His ministry began at about age 30. He was baptized in the Jordan River by his cousin John, as the scriptures say. He was then driven into the wilderness, tempted face to face with Satan. 3 temptations, that's what he faced. First, there was hunger. "Why don't you turn these stones into bread?" Then there was the testing of God. "Let me take you up to the very pinnacle of the temple, and you can cast yourself down, because then God says the angels will have charge over you." And then there was the temptation of power. All that you see, I will give to you if you fall down and worship me. Each moment, Jesus was able to respond with Scripture and defend himself against the evil one. That's how his ministry began, and that is how his ministry would begin to take shape. It didn't seem to begin very well, however, as he visited his hometown of Nazareth and spoke in the synagogue. He read from Isaiah chapter 61, and in verse 1 we read, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners." And then he said something that made them so angry. "Today," he said, "these words have been fulfilled in your hearing." They were ready to ride him out of town on a rail. "Isn't this Joseph's son? Isn't this the boy we saw wandering about in Nazareth?" They took him to the edge of town and were ready to throw him off the cliff. But Jesus escaped and went on to his ministry. His new hometown was Capernaum. That is the place from which he called most of his disciples. They were fishermen. There were at least 4 of them who were fishermen. There was the tax collector, whom we know as Matthew. Some called him Levi. He understood the value of what it meant to call people who were salt of the earth kind of people, who knew how to get their hands dirty. There were many occasions from Capernaum which are important to us in the scriptures. Capernaum is on the Sea of Galilee, and just north of Capernaum is a hillside, which is the site of many of Jesus' teachings. There was the Sermon on the Mount with the Beatitudes. Who are the people who are blessed? Who are the blessed? You are the light of the world, he said, looking up at the top of the hill. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. No one lights a lamp and then hides it under a bowl. No, you put it on a stand so it can give light to the whole house. You are to let your light shine so that others may see your deeds and give praise to your heavenly Father. He changed some of the laws to a certain extent. He used a formula that we have become familiar with here at Bethlehem Church. It goes like this. You have heard it said, do not murder. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother, you have been guilty of committing murder already. Or you have heard it said, do not commit adultery. But I tell you, if anyone looks at someone else lustfully, they have already committed adultery in their heart. Again and again he spoke. You have heard it said, anyone who divorces his wife must give a certificate of divorce. But I say to you, you have heard it said, do not break your oath, but keep the oaths you have made to the Lord. But I say to you, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, you have heard it said, love your enemy and your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. Well, you can't change Jewish law like that. A law that had stood for thousands of years and not raise the anger of the Jewish leadership. And so the shadows from the Jewish leadership began to fall across the pathway of Jesus. Something had to be done about this teacher. They set out to trap him along the way, and Jesus had his responses for their hypocrisy. Why do you look at the speck that is in your neighbor's eye, while there is a plank in your eye? You will recognize who is true, and you will recognize them by their fruit. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, this didn't make them happy. And so shadows continued to fall. Up on that same hillside north of the Sea of Galilee, just north of Capernaum, he fed the 5,000 by a gift from a boy, 5 loaves and 2 fish. The leaders were not happy when a Roman centurion came to Jesus and asked Jesus to heal his servant. Jesus said, I will go. But the centurion intervened and said, Master, you don't have to go. Just say the word. I too am a man of authority. I don't deserve to have you come under my roof. But as a man of authority, I say to one of my men, go, and he goes. I say, come, and he comes. Just say the word, and my servant will be healed. And Jesus told those who were gathered, I've not found such faith in all of Israel. Well, that's not a smart thing to say in front of Jewish leaders. A Roman has more faith than a Hebrew? That's preposterous. This man has to be stopped. The shadows fell. As Jesus' fame grew, people would come from miles to Capernaum to be healed. There were the demon-possessed. There was the man who was paralyzed, let down through a roof by his friends. There was a sick woman who had just touched the hem of his garment, a dead little girl, the blind, the deaf, the mute. Jesus healed them all. And wherever he went, people who walked in darkness came to know that here, in this man, was the light of hope. The light of hope. His disciples watched him walk across the water. Who is this? And then there was another time as they were amazed as Jesus calmed the storm. Who is this that even the wind and waves obey? It didn't help when he traveled through Samaria on his way to Jerusalem. No self-respecting Jew ever goes through Samaria. Ever. But there he was, sitting by the well. And who should come up to him right at midday at a time when that was not normal at all? What a woman. There he was in Samaria by a well, talking with a woman of all people, and a woman who had questionable morals at that. He amazed her by telling her what he knew about her, even not having known her, and then offered her the living water of salvation. But having gone through Samaria, the shadows again began to fall. Some scribes and Pharisees wanted to see him do a miracle, and he called them part of a wicked and adulterous generation. That's no way to make friends. His teaching was effective and without parallel. Many, many parables were told. There was the parable of the sower. He began to sow his seed, and some of it fell on fertile ground, other on rocky soil, some amongst the weeds. And as the harvest came, they began to sense how the fertile soil is what gave the best yield. And as the disciples inquired of Jesus, he said, that's where we need to plant our seed. There was the parable of the mustard seed, the smallest of seeds, yet grows into a great bush. There is the parable of the treasure hidden in the field, so that a man who finds it goes and buys the field in order to acquire the treasure. There is that pearl of great price, these kingdom parables. The pearl was of such price that again the man went and sold all that he had in order to acquire that pearl. Meanwhile, the shadows were growing. Why is it, the religious leaders asked, why is it that your disciples break the law by not washing their hands before they eat? Why did you heal that man with the withered hand on the Sabbath? Why did you harvest grain to eat in the palm of your hand on the Sabbath? They were gathering their evidence against Jesus. In Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples a question that was important to him. Who do the people, as you interact with them, who do the people say that I am? Well, some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, some say Jeremiah. But then he asked the clinching question that all of us must have as an answer prepared. But who do you say that I am? Finally, it was Peter who answered, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Peter answered for all of them. And he said to Peter, blessed are you, Peter, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. From now on you will be called the rock, and on this rock I will build my church. From that moment, Jesus began to tell them that he had to go to Jerusalem and suffer many things, that he must be killed, and on the third day he would rise again. And the final leg of his journey began as he made his way from the far north to the south, to Jerusalem. Oh, all along the way, there was more healing. There were more parables. He took the little children in his arms and says, to such belongs the kingdom of heaven. And unless you become like the little children, you will not inherit the kingdom. Oh, there's in Luke chapter 15 a series of parables about lost things. Lost things. There was a lost coin. A woman turned the household upside down in order to find that coin. And when she did, she called all of her friends and neighbors in to celebrate with her, for she had found her coin. There was, of course, the lost sheep. And as Jesus was teaching about the lost sheep, he told how the good shepherd leaves the 99 safely in the fold in order to go out and find the one that is lost. And when that shepherd comes back, he too calls all of his friends and family in order to share the celebration that the sheep that was lost is now found. And then there was the parable of the lost boy. A son who had gone to his father and said, Father, give me my share of the inheritance. for whatever reason, the father says he would do that, gave the son the money, and then off he went. Off he went into a far country where he wasted that money in so many ways we can't even begin to imagine. He finds himself at last feeding pigs. And he looked at the pods he was feeding the pigs, and he was so hungry, he thought, gladly I would eat the food that I'm feeding to the pigs. And he came to his senses and he said, I've been stupid, and I know it. I'm going back home. I'm going back home, and there I will become one of my father's servants, for I'm no longer worthy to be called his son. Well, as he made his way back home, the father was looking down the road and happened to see his son coming. He could not withhold his joy, ran down the road, greeted his son, and welcomed him home, saying to the servants, kill the fatted calf, put a ring on his finger, and bring shoes for his feet. This son, who was dead, is alive again. He was lost, but is found. Well, there's much more to the story as the older son is out in the field. He can't imagine what all the noise is about as he returns from the field, and so he asks the servants, what's going on? Well, your brother has come home, and your father has killed the fatted calf. We're enjoying a celebration. Well, the older son was incensed, and he wouldn't go in, so the father came out and said, all these years, I have labored for you faithfully. And this son of yours, who squandered your money on harlots, he comes home and you throw a party? Forget this. Forget this. All the father could say was, your brother, my son, was dead, but is alive again. He was lost, but is found. We're never told whether the older son ever goes in to greet his brother. But we do know that God desperately cares about lost things. And later on, when he comes to Zacchaeus, that was another mistake that Jesus made. When he comes to Zacchaeus, after conversation with Zacchaeus, Jesus identifies himself as one who comes to seek and to save the lost. It was in Jericho. All of the people were waiting to greet Jesus. Zacchaeus couldn't see, so he climbed up a tree. Being so short, he climbed up a tree, and there he was able to see Jesus. And Jesus came to the tree and looked up and said, Zacchaeus, come down. I must have dinner at your house tonight. Dinner? With a sinner? A tax collector? That was a mistake as far as the Jewish leaders were concerned. And the shadows kept growing longer and longer and longer. When he arrived in Jerusalem, the Passover week, it was amazing. It was amazing. He didn't feel as though it was dark at all. It was a gorgeous day. It was filled with light. The crowds were welcoming him as he rode down from the Mount of Olives, down into the valley known as the Kidron Valley, and then up toward Jerusalem again. And all along the way, the crowds welcomed him with glad shouts, Hosanna! Casting their garments and their palm branches and waving them, the children were so happy as they greeted Jesus, Hosanna! The prophet Zechariah said that the king would come, riding on a donkey, and there he was. There he was. In their joy, they did not see him pause. They did not see him pause to take a moment and weep over Jerusalem. They did not hear him whisper, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, if you had only known this day what makes for peace. But you did not know the time of God's visitation. More darkness. More darkness. The religious leaders came to Jesus and said, make them stop shouting. Make them stop with this welcome. And Jesus replied, I tell you, if these were to become quiet, the very rocks and stones would cry out. But here is what sealed the fate of Jesus. When he entered the temple court, Jesus found that it was filled with merchants selling sacrificial animals at exorbitant prices. There were money changers who would take the foreign money that the pilgrims had brought and they turned it into shekels. Shekels. Adding, of course, their additional profits and a temple tax, by the way. Jesus was incensed and began to turn over the tables, chasing the money changers out. My house is a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves. That very day, the temple officials knew that Jesus must die. Oh, they tried to trap him. Teacher, shall we pay taxes? Shall we pay taxes to Rome? It was a trick question. There was no real good answer to it. And Jesus said, give me a coin. Give me a coin. And he showed it to them and said, whose image is on this coin? Why, it's Caesar's image. Then render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, but unto God the things that are God's. That upset them. And the shadows grew. Another one tried another act of trickery. Master, what is the greatest of the laws? Well, Jesus said, you are a scribe, you are a keeper of the law of the temple. How do you read? Well, I read it to say that you are loved to love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And you are to love your neighbor as yourself. You have answered rightly, Jesus said. Do this and you will live. Do this and you will live. But then we are told that the lawyer was seeking to justify himself, and so he asked, who is my neighbor? And Jesus began to spin out one of the best loved of all of the parables, the parable of the Good Samaritan. There was a man who was going down the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among thieves. The thieves robbed him and beat him and left him for dead along the side of the road. Do you remember? First, there was a priest who came by, and seeing the man in distress on the side of the road, not knowing whether he is dead or alive, he crossed over to the other side and passed on by. The same with another religious leader, a Levite. He too saw the man, and for whatever reason wouldn't render help, and he passed on by. But then there came a Samaritan. The Samaritan looked at the man, cared for him, set the man upon his donkey, and carried the man to the nearest inn, and asked that the innkeeper please take care of him, and if there was any money that was due to the innkeeper upon his return, that the Samaritan would gladly pay for all of it. It was an incredible act of generosity. An incredible act of generosity. But do you see, using the priest and the Levite as passing on by, and the Samaritan as the one who is applauded for having helped the man? Jesus asked the attorney, so which of these three was the neighbor to this man left for dead on the side of the road? Why, the Samaritan, the lawyer responded. Go and do likewise, Jesus said. But the religious leaders were the butt end of the joke. And the Samaritan of all people, he was the hero. The shadows grew. The shadows grew. But there was nothing so direct as his attacks upon the religious leaders. He was so weary of the games that they were playing, so weary, he finally let them have it. The 7 woes, we call it. Woe to you, teachers of the law! You shut out the kingdom of heaven in men's faces. You do not enter yourselves, nor do you let others enter. Shadows. Woe to you, hypocrites! You travel land and sea to make a single convert, and then you make him into twice as much a son of hell as you are. Shadows. Woe to you, blind guides! You say if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing, but if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he is bound by his oath. Shadows. Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites all! You give a tenth of your spices, mint and dill and cumin, but you neglect justice and mercy and faithfulness. You're straining at a gnat, and you swallow a camel. More shadows. Woe to you, hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside you are full of greed and self-indulgence. Shadows. Woe to you! You are like whitewashed tombs, all beautiful on the inside, but on the outside, but on the inside, full of dead men's bones and corruption. Shadows. Woe to you! You build tombs for the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous. Fill up then the measure of the sin of your forefathers. Shadows. You snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell? Shadows. And with that he left the temple and would never return. But his teaching continued and did not relent. 10 virgins were waiting for the bridegroom. 5 were ready for his arrival, and they had plenty of oil in their lamps. The other 5 were foolish and did not have any oil, and they were not ready for the bridegroom when he came. Who do you suppose the foolish virgins were? You guessed it. The religious leaders. Shadows. The sheep and the goats were compared. They were separated one from the other by their willingness to serve or not. They were consigned to heaven or to hell because of their willingness or their unwillingness to meet the needs of their neighbors. Who do you suppose the goats were? You guessed it. Religious leaders. Shadows. They were always growing. Shadows. The shadows grew longer as the Sanhedrin contacted Judas. They arranged for Judas to betray Jesus and determined that it would happen soon. The shadows were growing darker and deeper. The plan was revealed when Jesus celebrated the Last Supper. Even Jesus knew. He said to his disciples, "One of you will betray me." "Lord, who is it?" they asked one another. "Lord, is it I?" "The one who dips his bread in the dish with me. That is the one." Judas. Judas. What you must do, do quickly. And Judas went out into the darkness. To the rest of them, Jesus said, "You will all abandon me. You'll all abandon me." "Not Peter," he said. He huffed and he puffed. "Though all the others desert you, I will not." "Peter," Jesus said, "Peter, before the night is over, you will deny that you knew me 3 times. Then the cock will crow." "Oh no, Master, no way that will happen." And then Peter wrestled with his own darkness. After the Holy Supper, Jesus left with his disciples for the Garden of Gethsemane. It was full darkness. And there Jesus struggled. "I do not want this cup. Father, if it be thy will, take this cup from me. But not as I will, but as you will." 3 times he prayed. 3 times that this cup would pass. And in the shadows of his deepest darkness, there were Peter, James, and John, asleep. Then Judas arrived with the temple guard, and with a kiss, Jesus was betrayed. Then taken to the Sanhedrin. There the religious officials who had been watching him so carefully put him on trial. When Caiaphas asked, "Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God," Jesus answered, "Yes, it is as you say." Caiaphas tore his robes at the blasphemy, and upon that tear, Jesus' fate was sealed. Shadows. On his way through the courtyard, Jesus looked across to see Peter. Peter, who had by now denied knowing Jesus 3 times, just as Jesus had told him. And in his shame, Peter heard the crow of the rooster and went out and wept bitterly. Peter was in his own darkness. But Jesus was now going before Pilate, the politician from Rome. Why in the world would these Hebrews want this man dead? Pilate wondered. King of the Jews, what kind of an accusation is that? He knew the loophole. I'll exercise my generosity, and I'll have Jesus released for the Passover feast. That's the custom. I will take care of this problem that way. So taking him before the crowd, he asked, "Who do you want? Would you like Jesus, who pronounced himself King of the Jews, or shall I release Barabbas?" And the crowd shouted, "Give us Barabbas! Give us Barabbas! What shall I do with Jesus?" "Crucify him! Crucify him!" O darkness! Pilate had Jesus flogged. Then they handed him over to be crucified. The soldiers were in charge now, and they wanted to have their fun. A scarlet robe was put around Jesus, a crown of thorns, and they knelt before him to mock. "Hail, King of the Jews!" They spat upon him and struck him. "Prophesy to us, O King of the Jews, who hit you?" Then they took off the clothes and gave him his cross and led him on his way to Golgotha. O darkness! O darkness! He stumbled on his way. Finally, he simply could not get up under the weight of the cross. So a man named Simon from Cyrene, he was pulled from the crowd in order to carry the cross for Jesus. And when they arrived at Calvary, they nailed him to the wood and they lifted him up. The religious leaders were still wagging their tongues. "He saved others. Let him save himself. Let him come down from the cross, and we will believe in him." He made his response, saying, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." The thief on one side joined the mocking, but the thief on the other side asked Jesus, "Jesus, please remember me when you come into your kingdom." And to that man, Jesus said, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Jesus' mother was there, along with other women. John also made it to the foot of the cross, and Jesus brought them together, saying, "Woman, behold thy son. Son, behold thy mother."
Then darkness covered the earth. Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The darkness of his spirit. Then he cried, "I thirst!" The darkness of spiritual endurance. Then he cried, "It is finished." The darkness of death. Then he cried, "Into thy hands I commend my spirit." And he gave up his ghost.
Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when they crucified my tremble, tremble. Were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Were you there when they laid him in the tomb? Were you there when they laid him in the tomb? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when they laid him in the tomb? Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy member of the Sanhedrin, and one of those who believed that Jesus was the Messiah, had a tomb very near to Golgotha, in which no one had yet been buried. He asked Pilate if he might be able to care for the burial of Jesus. He let him have the body. He wrapped it in linen cloth and was fortunate to bury the body by the time the Jewish Sabbath began. He rolled the massive stone against the entrance and sealed the tomb. Pilate placed soldiers at the tomb to prevent his disciples from stealing the body over the next several days. They stood their guard. Friday had come to its end.